What are the possible institutional models for ASEAN's external trade agreements? Well, there are three broad categories. First, combined or common ASEAN member state agreements. This is where rights and obligations are created with the non-ASEAN state, and on the side of ASEAN member states, either no rights are created amongst them, or the rights amongst them are enforced using means within ASEAN. Second, agreements involving ASEAN the organization as a separate party. This would require first that some kind of competence is transferred to ASEAN, and ASEAN could either conclude an agreement alone and in its own right, or drawing on the EU experience of mixity, ASEAN as an organization and its member states together could even conclude mixed ASEAN agreements. Third, ASEAN member state agreements. ASEAN's external trade agreements currently are a variant of this. They are plurilateral in nature, and this means that rights and obligations are created between member states as well as with the dialogue partner. ASEAN itself, however, though a separate legal person, is not a party. The way in which the ASEAN agreements are concluded has legal effects throughout the life of such agreements, from negotiation and conclusion, treaty making, through the possible breach of the agreements and recourse to available remedies, treaty breaking. Some of these effects may be intended and some may have been unintended. And we examine through the book questions such as, can we improve on the current method of concluding ASEAN agreements to better achieve ASEAN centrality? Are there ways to present ASEAN as a single actor in the process? Is there a way to involve the ASEAN Secretariat? We do not venture to suggest one moral trade agreement for ASEAN. Rather, we demonstrate that ASEAN can conclude trade agreements with non-member states in a number of different ways and then analyze their possible impact on the different stages in the life of an agreement. It provides a framework of analysis of the different methods by which ASEAN and its member states have and could conclude trade agreements with non-member states. The framework will be useful to those who examine treaty models, whether they be academic researchers or practitioners, including government officials and advisors. It will also be valuable particularly to those engaged in the comparative study of regional treaty-making practices. Our book offers insight into what might be the potential of ASEAN in the field of external relations in the longer run, and it will appeal to those interested in ASEAN's ability to achieve an ASEAN economic community.
The book that we've been writing, ASEAN External Agreements, shows, gives us a very interesting story about 10 very, very diverse member states that are acting collectively to negotiate trade and investment agreements. And what we can see from that is that diversity among the negotiating member states often results in lower ambition and less coverage. So that tells us why certain individual ASEAN member states are in fact going out there and negotiating by themselves, and third countries are approaching individual ASEAN member states rather than the ASEAN collective. The internal status quo of ASEAN regional integration in fact provides something like a ceiling to the external agreements. There's none of the external agreements actually in any provision, in any obligation, go further and beyond what ASEAN has internally so far achieved in terms of de jure regional integration. The limitation of ASEAN as a collective negotiator of external economic agreements is in fact due to the very, very diverse institutional and economic development levels among its member states. One of the best examples would be to compare institutional and economic development between Myanmar and Singapore. Countries as diverse as this can simply not take on the same obligations and implement them domestically. For that matter, countries that wish for a faster pace, for a speedier integration with third countries outside of the ASEAN collective, are in fact highly incentivized to go this alone and to negotiate agreements with those external partners by themselves. What role will ASEAN member states and ASEAN as a collective play in the big in this big game of trade and investment negotiations that is currently underway? And our finding in this particular instance is that ASEAN has a rather limited role, and what we can expect from RCEP as well is rather limited. And ASEAN member states, in fact, could be better off going alone. At the same time, what we suggest in the book is that there are ways of reconciling individual ASEAN member states agreements with the ASEAN Economic Community as much as the ASEAN plurilateral agreements.
Hi, I'm Edmund Sim, co-author of The Foundation of the ASEAN Economic Community, which I co-wrote with Stefano Inama of UNCTAD. Our book is a review and analysis of the ASEAN Economic Community, an ambitious program of economic integration in Southeast Asia, first set forth by ASEAN leaders and elaborated in the ASEAN Charter. The ASEAN Charter says that the ASEAN Economic Community consists of a single production base and a single market, and as articulated by ASEAN leaders, should be established by the end of the year 2015. Our book posits that in reality, the ASEAN Economic Community has already been in existence for many years, particularly in the form of the single production base. Primarily, Japanese automobile and electronics manufacturers have operated within ASEAN in a single production base for many years. What is intended to take place by the end of 2015 is the establishment of the single market and an expansion of the single production base throughout Southeast Asia. However, our book puts forth that the end of 2015 is merely the beginning of a long process of economic integration. That's because the single production base so far has been limited to a relatively small number of large companies, and much of ASEAN's industries have not been able to participate fully in the single production base. Similarly, the single market in ASEAN has not really materialized for many industries because of national barriers and borders. Hence, what is necessary in ASEAN is a form of dealing with post-border entry issues. Dealing with such post-entry issues requires that ASEAN needs to look at one of the two models of regional economic integration that have been most successful. In our book, we compare the ASEAN Economic Community with the European Union, which has strong regional institutions to deal with economic integration. We also look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which instead of having strong institutions, has a very detailed legal text and robust dispute resolution to deal with the issues of economic integration in North America. Our argument in our book is that ASEAN needs to follow one of these two models in order to achieve the full potential of the ASEAN Economic Community. That's because without using either one of these models, or a combination of the two, the ASEAN Economic Community is soon reaching the limits of its institutional and structural capacity to deal with economic integration. So our book provides a series of policy options after reviewing the various problems in the ASEAN Economic Community. These policy options can be reviewed and implemented by ASEAN's leaders over the coming years after 2015. By providing a summary and an overview of the ASEAN Economic Community, our book can also be used as a textbook for training in universities, corporate capacities, and other instances where people want to learn more about the ASEAN Economic Community. And it is our hope that through our book, some of the myths of the ASEAN Economic Community can be dispelled, and that the potential of the ASEAN Economic Community can be fully understood by all the peoples of ASEAN.
The focus of the book is the external relations of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of ASEAN. It presents the first comprehensive account of its international treaty-making practice, but includes also softer legal instruments such as declarations, memoranda of understanding, and plans of action. So why should you read this book? In our research, we found a burgeoning external relations practice of ASEAN. It's really coming of age as an international actor. To date, it has concluded about 200 international agreements and issued instruments with its external partners in the wider region and with strategic partners around the world. This is a thus far untapped resource for researchers both in law and in international relations. And we hope that also the book is a good starting point for further inquiries into ASEAN as an international actor. Some of the key findings of the book are, firstly, that you can distinguish between two main modes of operation in ASEAN external relations. One is ASEAN as an international organization with its own legal personality, own treaty-making powers, but that's just being used in a minority of cases. Our finding was that in most cases, it's the ASEAN member states acting together as a cohesive group, using ASEAN as a collective identity, as a label in interacting with the rest of the world. Another key finding is the kind of sensitivity ASEAN shows towards its member states and external partners in their dealings. Internally, that is well known as the ASEAN way, but we see that this also really translates into the external relations of ASEAN. So it's really becoming a hallmark of ASEAN as a global player. I'm confident that it will remain very active on the global stage. We've seen this as a trend in the last couple of years, and we're quite confident that it will continue this way. So the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is definitely a player to watch in the future.
ASEAN wasn't started as an organization. It was started as a pragmatic measure to create trust amongst countries that had been at war with one another. In 1967, when ASEAN was founded, Indonesia had just ended its confrontation with Malaysia and Singapore. Singapore had just been ejected from the Federation of Malaysia. The Philippines had a claim to Sabah, and in the north, the Vietnam War was raging. So it was essential back then, more than 50 years ago, to create this idea that there was an association, a community of nations. ASEAN developed very pragmatically. It didn't have a constitution. The Bangkok Declaration wasn't even meant to be a treaty. The Bangkok Declaration, which founded ASEAN, basically set up a mechanism for the foreign ministers to meet. And from those modest beginnings, ASEAN started to grow. The main impetus for ASEAN's growth over the last half-century was, firstly, the fear of communist expansion because of the Vietnam War, especially after the fall of South Vietnam in 1975. Secondly, after the resolution of the Vietnam War, it was economics. Vietnam became a member of ASEAN in the 1990s. It was followed shortly by Myanmar, Laos, and finally Cambodia, which rounded up the membership of ASEAN. except for Timor-Leste. After the end of the Vietnam War, the glue that held ASEAN together was economic progress, because the whole of ASEAN consists of 600 million people, a gigantic market if it can get together. The problem was that because of the way ASEAN had developed, there was no formal structure. Things had developed almost on the fly. Ministers would meet, they would issue a declaration, they would issue a statement of some sort, and the institutions developed from that. So by the beginning of the 21st century, it was felt by the leaders of ASEAN that it was necessary to formalize the structure, to create, in effect, a framework for ASEAN cooperation. ASEAN's ambition is to become a community of 600 million people. This community consists of three pillars: the ASEAN Economic Community, the ASEAN Political Security Community, and the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. All of this is supposed to happen by 2015, this year. But back at the beginning of the 21st century, there was no framework for this, no legal framework for this. Hence the push to have a formal agreement, which became the ASEAN Charter. The ASEAN Charter was signed in 2007, it's 8 years ago now almost. It was the results of the reports of an eminent persons group, which consisted of one member from each of the ASEAN member countries. The eminent persons group identified two major shortcomings in ASEAN. Firstly, the organization was very good at putting out statements and declarations, but not so good at following these up. It almost seems as if when the summit was held, the main aim was to have some sort of declaration rather than to have concrete action. And that was a major shortcoming. This is something that Secretaries General have identified over and over again. The second major shortcoming was that there was no means of settling disputes amongst ASEAN members. Now, if you want to be a rules-based community, which is the stated ambition of ASEAN in the Charter, you need to have a means of settling disputes. You can't let disputes drag on forever. The old strategy of ignoring the dispute, hoping that it would go away, just doesn't work, especially if you want to create an ASEAN economic community. And this is, as I said, the major driving force now for ASEAN as an organization. When we were tasked with drafting the Charter, the grand visions of the eminent persons group had to be reduced to hard language. And I was a member of that high-level task force which drafted it. And so what came out of the drafting process is not an ideal document. It is a compromise amongst the aims of 10 very different members. And the ASEAN Charter creates that framework for the ASEAN community. It creates a mechanism for monitoring. It creates dispute settlement mechanisms. I should say that these mechanisms of monitoring as well as dispute settlement are not perfect. In fact, if you read them and you see how they work in practice, one would say they are flawed. But they are a basis on which we can work. How is ASEAN going to achieve its ambition to create that community based on rule of law, the community that follows the rules? You need to have some sort of legal underpinning. It is impossible to create a rules-based community without that legal underpinning. The ASEAN Secretariat is the only neutral central organization that ASEAN has. How would we set this up? It would have to be part of the ASEAN Secretariat. Ideally, it should be headed by a Deputy Secretary General in order to give it that heft and clout necessary for it to work. It should be recruited from amongst the best, not national quotas, because national quotas is an invitation to mediocrity. We should be open to having people from outside ASEAN, because misplaced nationalism is an enemy to competence. You should pay the legal service competitively. Do not expect people to give up their jobs in Singapore, or Kuala Lumpur, or Manila to come to Jakarta to work for less than market rates. This is totally unrealistic. And above all, it must be clear to the member states that the legal service is independent and should not be influenced. And this is probably the most important element of all, that the member states should recognize that the legal service is for the benefit of ASEAN as a whole. They should not try to influence their nationals in the legal service, and they should not try to impose their will on the legal service. Can it be done? The answer is only if the political leaders have the will to do it. ASEAN is an institution that is powered by a mixture of idealism and hot air. And very often the hot air takes precedence. People make these wonderful declarations about having a rules-based organization, following the rule of law. This is the time to show that they are serious about it, by creating a proper legal service at the center to support the Secretary General, to support the summit, to support the ASEAN organs, and to demonstrate to ASEAN citizens and to the world that we are serious about creating the ASEAN community.
ASEAN is actually more than the economic community, but economists understand the economics of the community better than many non-economists. Right? For the economists, the benefits of economic integration are actually very clear-cut. Right? First of all, you have an enlarged market. What's the importance of an enlarged market? An enlarged market means you can enjoy economies of scale, more production, lower costs, and therefore lower prices for consumers. Right? Then economic integration under the AEC also means you have larger resources because you have inflows of foreign capital, foreign technology, and even foreign skills and labor. So it increases your pool of domestic resources, right? And therefore you can have accelerated economic growth, more employment opportunities. Thirdly, and this is an aspect sometimes is somewhat controversial, economists always believe competition is good, but businessmen don't like competition. So we said that the AEC provides a more competitive environment. What does it mean, right? You have more producers, more suppliers, more imports, so you compete a lot. Now, in the process of competition, you improve yourself, right? You want to do better than the others. So it results in a competitive spirit, which therefore spurs efficiency, it spurs innovation, it spurs creativity. So these are the major benefits. When the AEC scorecard was published a few years ago, there was practically panic. Right? Why? Because it says the scorecard shows that implementation was very poor. Not only that, 20015 and 2015 is coming very, very fast, and yet we are so far from the target. So as a result of which, there was a lot of soul searching, and policymakers try to see how we can speed up the process. Now, what are the implementation problems? Right? Analysts as well as policymakers have admitted to some of the problems. Basically, some would argue that there's not enough commitment. Right? In other words, you promise to do what you do, but you never carry out. So it shows a lack of political will. But that begs the question, why is it you have AEC and yet you lack political will? Then the question is, why is it difficult to implement? Okay, What are the problems in implementation that the AEC scorecard shows? It says, in the case of tariff elimination, well and good, everybody follows the schedule and implement. But when it comes to non-tariff barriers, implementation is very poor. What do you mean by non-tariff barriers? For example, regulations regarding a particular good or a particular service, right? Like say cosmetics, it must have certain types of ingredients that are permitted and so on. So when it comes to non-tariff barriers, it is very difficult because countries impose non-tariff barriers for a variety of reasons, to protect the consumer, to protect the producer, not necessarily because of international trade. So identifying what are non-tariff measures as against what are non-tariff barriers. Barriers are barriers to trade. Measures are if you impose for security reasons, health reasons, and so on.
Hi, my name is Simon Chesterman. One of the things that's always fascinated me about ASEAN is its aspirations to move from being a periodic meeting of ministers to a real legal community. And so I was delighted to get involved in this integration through law project. And the topic that I picked was to look at monitoring. As you think about an organisation becoming a rules-based organisation, becoming something that's intended to be taken more seriously, one of the key questions is whether agreements are actually followed through on. One of the really fascinating things I discovered was that within ASEAN there was in fact a history of monitoring obligations, but it was very inconsistent. It was inconsistent both across the different areas of obligations, but also in the tools of monitoring that were available. And in particular, there was a distinction between monitoring of substantive compliance, that is, following through on what you said you were going to do in practice, and implementation, formal implementation in the sense that you had formally passed a law or something, but less relevant to whether that law was actually being complied with. So what I did in the book, and what I hope you'll find interesting, is look at this evolution of monitoring, because as ASEAN seeks to become a community, that's going to be one of the key questions, whether its obligations are followed through on. There are still barriers. Two barriers in particular remain. The first is that if you're serious about monitoring, the monitors need resources. And so the ASEAN Secretariat needs to play more of a role in ensuring that obligations are followed through on and that the information about that follow through is shared with the members. The second barrier really is the key, which is the historic unwillingness, or at least wariness of member states to actually take on binding obligations. But I think there is evidence in the record, in particular in the economic community, but also to some extent in the political security and socio-cultural communities, that ASEAN is becoming more willing to see its obligations monitored, and it's possible that we might see, as the community is formed, that community will actually lead to compliance. So please, buy the book, let me know what you think.
My name is Edmund Sim, and I'm a co-author of Rules of Origin in ASEAN, which I co-wrote with Stefano Inama of UNCTAD. Our book covers the various issues related to rules of origin and certificates of origin in the ASEAN Economic Community, and namely the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. Now you may ask yourself, what is a rule of origin? A rule of origin is simply a term of reference that applies to the various concepts related to determining whether a good qualifies for preferential treatment under the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. So in that way, it is like a nationality law, but for goods and not people. Similarly, a certificate of origin simply refers to the documentation needed to qualify a good for the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. In that regard, it could be likened to a passport for a person. To illustrate how important these rules are, I'll use myself as an example. So my father came from Malaysia, and his family came before that from Thailand and Vietnam, originally from China. So if you look at it from that basis, I'm 50% ASEAN origin because of my father. My mother came from Hong Kong, so I'm 50% non-ASEAN origin. So if you apply the standard rule of origin in the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, I'm 50% value added from ASEAN, and I would qualify as an ASEAN national. But using the rules of the United States, because I was born in the United States, the act of substantial transformation means that I was actually born in the United States and have the nationality of the United States. So I'm not an ASEAN national. That gives you an illustration of how rules that apply to people and things are crucial to the application of the agreements, particularly the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement for the ASEAN Economic Community. Our book posits that it is necessary to simplify these rules and make them easier to implement and understand so that everyone in ASEAN, not just large companies dealing in the automobile and electronics industries, can participate in the ASEAN Economic Community and benefit from the improved economic conditions and growth that the ASEAN Economic Community promises for its peoples.